In this video we're going to be demonstrating soldering with copper tube. We've got all of our fittings here. Just take you over to this diagram right here. This is the diagram that we're going to be building. You can see in between each of the fittings we need to cut some tubing to go in between the fittings here. So all the measurements are made. Note how the measurements are center to center, right? So from here, let's actually look down here, from here to here is 7 inches center to center. So that's going to tell us some information that we need to get the right length of copper tube here. And same with here, we have 4¼ inches from here up to here, center to center. So this is our copper tube right here. We're going to be using type, you can see right on the, it's type L 1/2 inch copper tube. Type L has to do with the wall thickness and the pressure rating of the copper tubing. So what we'll do first is we're going to cut one piece of the copper tubing and then solder it into place. Alright, so I've installed a 90 copper 1/2 inch fitting here on our tube end, and I've marked it with a felt marker just to show the engagement here of the tubing. You can see that it goes in right to that rib, you can see. And if we measure that engagement, I'll just maybe we'll go from 1, start at 1 there. It's about 1/2 inch. I'll just slide this over a little bit. There, you can see a little bit better. It's about 1/2 inch from here, from the end to there. So the engagement of the copper tube is 1/2 inch. The other thing I wanted to point out, the more important of the two, is the fitting allowance. So from the center over here, the center of the fitting, because most of our measurements are made from center to center, so from the center of the fitting out to that mark is about, it's 7/8 of an inch. So you can see it's not quite an inch, it's 7/8 of an inch. And the reason why we want to know that is we want to know the distance from right here to the center, because that there we don't need to, we can subtract from our center to center measurements on each fitting. So the fitting allowance, which is from here, which is, open like that a little bit better, it's from here to the center of the fitting. So 7/8 minus the 1/2 inch right here is a total of 3/8 of an inch. So that means that our fitting allowance on this fitting, and it's going to be on all of our fittings, is about 3/8 of an inch. So going from right here on the tape measure, you can see, back to 1 inch, puts us right in the center of the fitting, which is 3/8 of an inch. So when we do our center to center measurements, and if we have a fitting on either side, the actual length of tubing that we need to cut is going to be minus 3/8 of an inch times 2, which ends up being 3/4 of an inch. So 3/8 plus 3/8 is 6/8 of an inch, which ends up being simplified down to 3/4 of an inch. So our fitting allowance is going to be that we're subtracting off our center to center measurements. As long as there's a fitting on either end, we'll subtract 3/4 of an inch. Alright, so for our first measurement right down here, we're going to cut this pipe length. And since we have a center to center measurement, we need to subtract off the fitting allowance on each side, which we determined was 3/8 of an inch or 3/4 of an inch when we have the two fittings. So that means we're going to have 7 inches minus 3/4 of an inch, which means we'll have left over 6¼ inches. So we need to cut this to a length of 6¼ inches. Right there, you can see that I have measured and marked our tube at 6¼ inches, so I'm going to go ahead and cut that now. Alright, I have our copper tubing installed in a piping vise here. It's got a chain on it, you can see, and a handle down here that over on this side here that tightens the chain into place. Just to demonstrate, I'll loosen that off, and you can see here that the chain comes off like that. We put the tubing in place, and then we turn the handle and it tightens the chain, and it bites down on the tubing, holds the tubing in place. So then when we actually go to cut here, the tubing won't turn. Alright, so I have my tubing cutters installed. You can see the wheel should be cutting right on our mark, 6¼ inches. And so I should just now be able to turn this and tighten it every couple turns until the tubing falls off. Alright, so after cutting the tubing, you can notice that we have a little bit of burrs on our tubing. The outside, not so much. I have this deburring tool here designed for copper tubing, and we can just now take that tool and turn it inside the copper pipe and remove any of those sharp burrs. And of course, we're going to want to dump all the burrs out into the garbage so they don't get caught up in the copper tube line. Okay, so next, now that we've deburred both sides of our tubing here, what we want to do is rough up and clean off any of the oxidized. The copper tube will have a thin coating of an oxidized material on it that we want to clean off, because that's going to help improve the solder joint. So you just need to use this emery cloth to kind of rub off that oxidized and clean up the copper piping before we solder it. Alright, and so it should look like that after it's been cleaned up. Alright, so we also want to remove the oxidation from the fitting that we're going to be soldering in, so we use a wire brush to clean that out and rough it up as well and get rid of the oxidized copper. And so it should look something like that on the inside once it's roughed up. You can see here's the other side that hasn't been roughed up. It is pretty clean already, or it doesn't have much oxidation on it. This fitting, it's pretty shiny, but we still want to do that just to ensure that we're getting all the oxidation off. Alright, so after we've cleaned up our copper tube here, we want to apply some flux to the copper tube. The flux is going to help draw the solder into the solder joint. And notice how I'm wearing rubber gloves. It's recommended on the safety data sheets to wear rubber gloves when we're working with the flux paste. So we'll put a little bit around the tube there, and then we also need to apply some right inside the fitting here as well. So we ensure we have it on both the fitting and on the tube. So we don't need to put a whole bunch in, just make sure that we have it evenly spread, and we can stick it onto the fitting. And if there's a whole bunch of excess, we've got a little bit of excess here, we can kind of clean that up with a rag, because if we do have the flux out over here, when we heat up the tube, the solder wants to go to the flux, right? So some of it might start to come over here and make it pretty messy. So we just want the solder going into our joint and filling it evenly, and a little bit of solder kind of sticking out when we're done. So now we'll go ahead and apply some heat and solder the joint. All right, so for producing our heat for liquefying the flux and melting the solder, we're going to be using propane here and a torch. So the torch here just threads right onto the top of the propane bottle here, and then it should be ready to go. So I'll just thread this on, and to use the torch, there's a red on-off button right here. So if I press that, it should light, and then you can see our torch is ready to go, ready for use. So what we do want to make sure is that this is on securely, and that we don't have any dirt or anything in the threads before we install the torch on the bottle. Alright, so for heating up the joint, we're going to want to apply heat on the bottom half. The heat rises, so it will then heat up the top half of the joint. And the solder that we're using here is a lead-free 95.5 solder. So I'm going to heat the joint from the bottom, and then once it's hot enough and the flux is liquefied, I should be able to touch the solder to the joint, and then through capillary action it's going to suck the solder into the joint. So I'll go ahead and do that. Alright, so this is still quite warm. I'll just bring the camera in a little bit closer. You can see right here where I was touching the solder. That's where it sucked all the solder, and you can see if you look around the joint there, we can see that the solder is, you just go all the way around the joint, we can see that there's solder showing completely around the whole joint. So that's a good indication that we got solder in and all around the joint, and so it should provide a good seal. Another thing I wanted to point out is you can see we had a little bit extra solder drip here on the floor, so we want to be aware of that. That we want to be wearing proper footwear, steel toe boots, just to ensure that we're not burning our feet. And obviously the other hazard too, when we're working with this hot material or the copper, we want to make sure that we're using welding type glove that's going to be heat resistant and not allow us to get burnt. So whenever we're working with any of the torches, we want to ensure that we have the proper gloves on and the proper footwear. Alright, so I've cut the remaining chunks of tubing here and placed them in the fittings. I used some emery cloth to rough up and remove the oxidation, applied flux on all the fittings, and I just used a cloth here, or a rag, just to kind of clean up the flux around each of the fittings so we don't have a whole bunch of it dripping everywhere when we're heating it up to take the solder. I've also ensured that, looking at it this way, that my top piece of copper tubing is straight up and down. It's parallel with the rest of the tubing, the square part, or the rectangle part. So the next step here now is to heat up all these joints and apply solder. And then the last step is to pressure test it to make sure all of our joints are holding. So I'm going to go ahead and solder the remaining joints. Alright, so there's our finished product. It's all soldered. Some suggestions, just to make sure that we do measure before we go and solder all these joints together. I've already done this, and I did do this beforehand, but make sure that your center to center measurements all line up, and the face of the brass fitting up here to the center of the tube is the 3 inches as specified. So make sure you make all those measurements in case you did cut one of these. These are likely going to be right if it all fits together like this, but if this one here is off, you want to make sure you either shorten it or cut the right length of a piece. So that's just a suggestion. Make sure you make all those measurements, because I am going to be looking to make sure that it does, all the measurements are correct as they were shown on the diagram. Alright, now that I've soldered all the joints, I've connected it to our water pump here, so we can hydro test to see if there's any leaks on fittings here, on any of the soldered fittings. So what I'm going to go ahead and do right now, you can see the gauge here on the pump is reading 0 psi or 0 kPa. We're going to go ahead and pressure this up to about 100 pounds or 100 psi and just see if we have any leaks on any of our fittings. This is going to be our final check to confirm that all of these soldered joints here are holding.
So there now you can see I'm pressured up to 100 psi here, and it's been sitting there. I've had it there for about a minute or so, and the gauge has not moved.
And there are no leaks here on any of the fittings that I can see. No water dripping. So we've confirmed that all of the soldered joints are holding. Alright, so for cleanup we're going to make sure we put all of our tools away, and of course we want to make sure that torch has a good couple minutes to cool off before we place it back in our case for it. The other thing that I want to point out is any of the metal, solder or anything like that that is dripped on the floor, any of the flux or anything like that, we'll be picking up the solder and disposing it in the garbage. Since it is lead free, we can do that. And we'll also be using, if there is a lot of flux spots or anything like that on the floor, using the mop to clean up that. And any other chunks of copper tubing or anything like that will also need to be disposed of. We want to leave the workplace the way it was left when we, or the way it was when we came.